Got a phone call yesterday from David. David said, now I only want you to put 15 minutes into doing this. He says, I want you to get a sermon out of your files and bring it with you to church on Sunday and have it ready just in case I can't preach. David's voice was going even then, and this morning it was barely above a whisper. So, I looked at the lessons for this Sunday, and I saw that the Old Testament lesson was from 1 Kings. Now, I've got files of all my sermons over the years, almost 40 years worth, and I filed them not alphabetically or by date or anything like that. I filed them according to the scripture reference that is being used. So I went to the file that said 1 Kings, and I pulled it out, and lo and behold, like Mother Hubbard's cupboard, it was bare. It was empty. So I thought, I must have never preached on that text. So I looked at Luke's file. Yeah, there's a lot in there, but nothing on the gospel lesson for today. So I was getting a little nervous. I was going, hope there's something in Galatians. So I turned to Galatians. Sure enough, there was, but it wasn't the text for today. So I started thinking, and all of a sudden I remembered, as I was going through my recovery period from surgery, I saw an old episode from Andy Griffith, and I remembered the story, and I remembered, I think I preached a sermon on that one time. Now, like I said, I've got like 40 years worth of sermons almost, and I don't say I've never done it, but I rarely preach the same sermon twice. You may never have heard it, but I always think it's good discipline for me to work with the text and to wrestle with the text and to write them as fresh as I can, except for this week. Saturday morning at 11 o'clock till Sunday morning at 11 o'clock is not a whole lot of time to put one together, considering I had some other things and I wanted to sleep during the night. So I found this sermon. It's a long introduction, but here we go. Like I said, I watched this episode of Andy Griffith, and I remember reading or hearing somewhere where somebody made the observation that the Andy Griffith Show, based on its longevity, is the most popular show in television history. More than 50 years after it aired, you can pick up an episode of Andy Griffith on probably half a dozen different channels on your television. It is broadcast and translated into all kinds of languages all over the world. There are probably a number of reasons why that is true. First of all, I imagine it has something to do with the humor in it. No matter how many times we may have seen a particular episode, we find ourselves laughing at the antics of Barney or Gomer. I wish I could have a name like Gomer. Otis, Floyd the Barber, or Aunt Bee. But in addition to the humor, for many, the appeal of the Andy Griffith Show is the picture it paints of a time when life was much simpler and safer. And whether or not there ever really was such a time, we like to think there was. And that show transports us, we believe, back to that time and that age. Then, too, there's the feeling of community that show has, as it presents people who know and genuinely care for one another, where people are accepted for who they are, with all of their faults, with all of their failures, with all of their foibles, with all their idiosyncrasies. But there is also woven through the stories of that show a wisdom that continues to ring true better than 50 years after it first aired. Take, for example, the episode where Opie makes a friend with a man who works for the telephone company by the name of Mr. McBeevy. Now, Opie doesn't see him as a worker for the telephone company. Opie describes him in almost mythical terms. He's someone who has rings on his fingers and bells on his toes. And he makes jingling sounds as he walks around in the tops of the trees in the woods. He has 12 extra hands, and he can make smoke come out of his ears. All the kinds of things that would captivate the mind and the curiosity and the imagination of a little boy. Now, at first, Andy believes Mr. McVeevy to be just what it sounded like, a mythical figure, the product of Opie's fertile imagination, an imaginary friend that many children have. But in the beginning, Andy is content to allow Opie to have his imaginary friend. But a crisis occurs when Opie has some money that Andy can't account for. It's a quarter, not much by our standards today, but for a little boy back in the 1950s or whenever the show started, it's a lot of money. And when Andy asks where Opie got the money, he says Mr. McVeevy gave it to him. And like I said, that produces a crisis for Andy because Andy knows there is no such thing as a Mr. McVeevy who makes jingling sounds when he walks around in the tops of the trees of the woods. But on the other hand, how does Andy explain? What explanation is there to account for how Opie got this money? And so as Andy and Barney are talking about this and what Andy needs to do about it, Andy says this: at times like this, where you're asked to believe something that doesn't make any sense, it comes down to having faith in someone. Then you believe in Mr. McVeevy? Barney asks. No, Andy replies, but I believe in Opie. When we're asked to believe something that doesn't make any sense, when we're asked to believe something and all of the evidence points to the contrary, it makes all the difference in the world if we can trust, if we have faith in the person who is asking us to believe. That's what Abram had to learn. You may remember the story how God first comes to Abram, tells him to leave his land and move to a land that he's never seen before, and in the process, God is going to make of him a great nation. And so he does. Abram, that is. He packs up everything he owns and takes all of his servants and his wife, and he heads off for a land that he's never seen before. And he does this all on a promise from God that would make of him a great nation, that God would make his name great, that God would make of him a blessing, so much so that through him all of the nations of the earth would be blessed. Go from your kindred, your country, and your father's house to the land that I will show you, the Lord said to Abram. And as we read the story, we see that is exactly what he did. But as so often happens, things didn't exactly turn out the way they thought they would. You may remember that for all the promise of descendants that would come to become a great nation, no children were forthcoming. For Sarai, Abram's wife, was barren. There is a particular pain that comes from the inability to conceive, that unless you've experienced it, it's hard to describe. A year or so after Marilyn and I were married, Marilyn became pregnant. About 3 months into her pregnancy, however, she miscarried. Now, the pregnancy was a surprise. I mean, we'd planned on having children someday. We just hadn't planned on having them that soon. But once we were pregnant, our plans and our timeline changed. We were excited. We really looked forward to having a baby. So soon after her miscarriage, we began to try to conceive again. but without success. We tried to conceive for better than 3 years. During that time, a lot of our friends began to have children, which created kind of a dilemma for us. For on the one hand, we wanted to genuinely celebrate and rejoice and be happy for our friends. But on the other hand, every time we heard of somebody having a baby, it only reminded us of what we had and lost and didn't have anymore, and what's more, didn't seem to be able to have again. And like I said, that pain, if you've never experienced it, is hard to describe. But for Abram and Sarai, it was more than just the pain and frustration of not being able to conceive. It was more than just the shattered hopes and dreams. It was more even than all of their unanswered prayers put together. For you see, theirs was a culture where, no other way to say it, theirs was a culture in a time when a woman's worth was in large part determined by her ability to conceive and bear children, and where the ability to do so was understood to be a sign of God's blessing, of God's favor, and the inability to do so was seen as a sign of God's displeasure or curse. So when God comes to Abraham in our lesson for this morning with the promise that he was going to make of him a great nation, that his name would be great, and through him of the earth would be blessed, and having said that now, says that he's going to bless Abram for having delivered Lot. Abram grabbed hold of a promise the way some people grab hold of a promise of a miracle cure from some suffering they're going through. But as time passed and Sarai continued to be barren, it became harder and harder and harder for Abraham to continue to believe in God's promises. For how do you continue to believe in the promise when there doesn't seem to be any evidence to support it? How do you continue to believe in a promise when it goes on and on and on without being fulfilled? How long do you believe a promise before you wonder if it's ever going to come true? This is where we find Abram in our lesson for this morning. As I said, the Lord has just told him that he's going to bless Abram for rescuing Lot. But Abram, and I suspect somewhat cynically, says, "O Lord, what good will your reward do me since I have no children? Because you have not fulfilled your promise and given me children, one of my slaves will be my heir." But God reassures Abram, telling him that his heir will not be one of his slaves, but will be from his own issue. And then God takes Abram outside and has him look up into the starry sky, and he says, "Count the stars if you can." The number of stars might as well be the number of descendants you're going to have, Abram. And the lesson for this morning ends with these words, that Abram believed the Lord. Now, as far as stories in the Bible go, this one plays somewhat of a minor role. It certainly isn't on the scale of Adam and Eve eating the forbidden fruit and being exiled from the Garden of Eden. It isn't on the scale of Abraham's call to sacrifice his son once he has him, or the story of David and Goliath, or any of the great stories that we learned as children in Bible school. For that matter, I doubt if this story is even in any collection of children's Bible stories. But that's okay. It's okay because not every story told becomes a bestseller. And not every movie that is made is nominated for, much less wins an Academy Award. But that doesn't mean that books aren't important, the movies aren't important, and it certainly doesn't mean that the story isn't important because we're not that familiar with it. It is a critically important story for people of faith. For I dare say there isn't a one of us here in the sanctuary this morning or in any church that is gathered to God this morning who, if we take our relationship with God seriously and want to live a life of faith, There isn't one of us who will not find ourselves going through a time like Abram and Sarai, if we haven't already gone through it ourselves. Times when things don't turn out the way we want them to. Times when things happen that we don't understand. When things don't seem to make sense. Times when we may even question and doubt God's love or power or presence or guidance. Times when our prayers for healing or for our kids to turn around or for God to do a miracle in a marriage seem to go unanswered. Or if they are answered, they're answered in a way that wasn't at all what we expected. This is a critically important story because we need to know that at such times, what we're going through is very normal for people of faith. We're not the only ones who are going through that experience. Others have gone through it before, and others will go through it after us. When we find ourselves in situations, however, like this, we need to remember, I think, what Andy told Barney about whether or not he believed in Mr. McBeevy. At those times when we're asked to believe something that doesn't make sense, when there doesn't seem to be any evidence to support what we're being asked to believe, it comes down to, do we have trust? Do we have faith in whoever is telling us to believe? And in this case, it happens to be God. The scriptures are filled with the promises of God. And the question is, do we believe them? We don't know what enabled Abram to continue to believe and trust God and God's promise when there was no evidence to support that trust, except for the fact that he chose to do so. And that's what faith is. It's a choice. It's a decision. It's a choice and a decision we make, a choice that may be accompanied by feelings of peace and joy or some other feeling that we interpret as a confirmation of what we have chosen to believe. But just as often, and perhaps more often than not, our decision to believe is not accompanied by any feelings at all. When the author of the letter to the Hebrews says that faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen, the assurance is based on God's promise, not how we happen to feel about it. You see, we can either look around and choose to believe based on what we see or what we don't see, what we feel or what we don't feel. Or we can choose to trust God regardless of what we see or don't see, of what we feel or don't feel. I think maybe the writer of the book of Proverbs says it best. The writer of Proverbs says, "Trust in the Lord with all your heart, and do not rely on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he will direct your paths." Faith is a choice. It's what we choose to believe. And then how we live out what we've said we believe. May God grant us strength to live the life of faith. Amen.